Welcome to Kansas History, a Journal of the Central Plains podcast, a collaborative project of the Kansas Historical Foundation and Department of History at Kansas State University. I am your host, Lisa Caitlin Highsmith, and today I am joined by Hollie Marquess, who will be discussing her article, The Frontier Demimonde, Prostitution in Early Hays City, 1867 to 1883. Hollie is an instructor in the Department of History at Fort Hays State University who specializes in U.S. women's and gender history and the history of sexuality. Hello, Hollie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
First, could you tell us what drew you to this research?
Well, I've always been drawn to the history of sexuality, the history of marginalized groups, the kind of history that often gets relegated to the footnotes or left out of the narrative entirely, which is certainly true of sex work. I knew that there were prostitutes in Hays City from the beginning, but I couldn't find them in the historical scholarship. Most of the academic articles on Hays City focus on the notable men and the Wild West atmosphere of Hays, but there was little mention of sex work in Hays City. I wasn't sure what primary source information I'd be able to find when I began the project, or what kind of narrative that research would lead me to, but I knew I wanted to give these women a voice.
Can you set the scene for us? What was Hays City like in the 19th century?
When Hays City was founded in 1867, it was positioned about a mile from the military post Fort Hays. And for about a year, Hays City possessed the terminus for the Union Pacific Railroad. So this meant that much of the nation's east to west passenger and freight traffic came through Hays. Between the railroad traffic and the soldiers at the fort coming to carouse on payday, Hays City was pretty wild and woolly. It was known for shootouts, lawlessness, and vice in those early days. Elizabeth Custer, who was at the fort with her husband, General George Custer, said that they could hear pistol shots coming from Hays City so often that it seemed to her like a perpetual 4th of July. And as is true for most Western towns, sex workers were often among the first to arrive and played more important roles in the foundations of these Western towns than many give them credit for. Much of the economic life of Hays City centered on the saloons, gambling dens, and houses of prostitution in those early days, and even more so after the railroad terminus moved farther westward and the population shrank.
What role did prostitution play in the local economy?
Prostitution contributed to the local economy in a number of ways. Sex work drew soldiers from the fort into Hays City on payday to patronize the saloons and the houses of prostitution. The same is true for those stopping in Hays on their way westward. And this becomes especially important after the railroad terminus moves farther west and the population shrank to about 300 residents. At that point, Hays City was almost entirely dependent on its nightlife for its economic vitality. To give an idea of how important this nightlife was, in 1870, which was a year after the railroad terminus moved west, the Board of Commissioners approved 37 liquor licenses, which is a lot for a population of 300. Not only did the prostitutes draw people in to spend their money on payday, prostitutes in Hays City were regularly buying and selling property of considerable value. Prostitutes secured mortgages on properties even though the lien holders knew that the properties in question served illegal functions, which speaks to the tacit acceptance of prostitution as a necessary, if not always socially accepted, profession in emerging Western towns. Prostitution offered women on the frontier opportunities for income, independence, and economic freedom outside of marriage. This income wasn't just important for the individual prostitutes, though. Through paying fines, sex workers kept the town's coffers full. Western towns recognized that prostitutes generated considerable revenue. So rather than try to expel them or lock them all up, local sheriffs imposed fines for prostitution. And those fines paid salaries for sheriffs and justices of the peace. These near monthly arrests and finings amounted to an informal license to operate. Hays City prostitutes almost always had the ready cash to pay those fines. When the undersheriff, Frank Shepard, was charged with beating a prostitute named Nettie Baldwin in her home, he did not have the $5 and costs after being found guilty, so he spent 3 months in jail. On the other hand, just 1 month prior to that incident, the same prostitute, Nettie Baldwin, appeared in court on the charges of being a keeper of a brothel or bawdy house, and she paid her $6 in costs with no issue. So Sex workers were contributing through these fines and through their role in the nightlife, but they also served as witnesses in important murder trials, and they performed important social functions like nursing the sick and the dying, including a member of law enforcement. Of course, they also served an entertainment value as well, and not just for their sex work, but as fodder for the newspapers, which would report on the antics of the Demimonde regularly.
Can you explain the four styles that you mention in the article?
Certainly, prostitutes in the West typically worked in one of four styles. Prostitutes who worked in brothels had the highest status of these four styles, but that category was broad. This could be a high class brothel that served fine liquor in a parlor and had music and maybe gambling. Often, these high class establishments made more money off of the liquor sales than the actual sex work. But brothels could also be much smaller in scale and not as high class. Typically, prostitutes working in a brothel did so under a madam who may or may not be entertaining her own clientele. Saloon or dance hall workers who engaged in sex work were the next step down in status. And again, this category was pretty broad. Not all saloon or dance hall workers did engage in prostitution. Some engaged in sex work only when necessary, others did so regularly. Crib workers were further down on the status rung and operated in smaller homes or flimsy shacks, which were less associated with fine liquors and entertaining in the parlor and more about the volume of customers. Cribs also lacked the protection that working under a madam had the potential to provide. And then the lowest status belonged to streetwalkers. Most of the Hay City prostitutes operated in small brothels or cribs. Variations of all of these groupings existed, and it was not uncommon for someone to work in a saloon and then also entertain men in a crib. The newspapers and court records from this time period use most of these terms interchangeably, and they're not always using the appropriate category or term for the dwellings or the types of prostitution. So, this can make the effort to assign frontier prostitutes to simple categories complicated.
It seems like these women were truly integral to life in Hayes City. Can you describe to our listeners how that began to change, both socially and economically?
In the mid to late 1870s, Volga Germans started settling in Ellis County. And as this happens, family farming began to replace the saloons and the houses of prostitution as the driving economic force in Hayes City. So, as more Volga German families settled in the area, attitudes start to shift toward the prostitutes. These attitude shifts were represented in the fines as well. Fines that were once $1 to $6 became $100 to $250 or higher. The newspapers still use stories of prostitutes as grist for their readers, but the tone shifted from amusement and recording their antics in a playful way to using phrases like, another prostitute was yanked into the iron embrace of our county jail. Prostitutes started getting convictions instead of just fines, and liberation from those convictions only on the promise to leave town for good. You start to see more letters to the editor being written in newspapers calling for the removal of prostitutes from Hay City or moving them to the outskirts of the city so that they wouldn't be as visible to families. Because the Volga Germans were settling as Catholic farming families, that meant that wives and children were present, and that sex workers were no longer among the only female inhabitants of the city. The messages that the Volga German families were hearing in their churches about licentious husbands and the unbridled lust in houses of ill fame, combined with the presence of, quote, respectable women and children in Ellis County, and that shift toward family farming as the primary source of revenue, contributed to the shifting attitude toward prostitution in Hay City.
Holly, that's absolutely fascinating. Do you happen to have any future projects or research that you'd like to share?
I have two, actually. I'm working on a project that focuses on female impersonation in Kansas. Between the 1880s and 1930s, female impersonation, or what we'd call drag today, was wildly popular on the vaudeville scene and much more popular in Kansas than I initially suspected. The other project is to expand on my recent prostitution article and to look at sex work in other Western Kansas frontier locations. And I'd love to be able to trace where some of the women from my article went after they left Hays City.
Thank you so much for talking with us today, Holly.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to learn more about the topics discussed on this podcast, consider becoming a subscriber to our journal, Kansas History, a Journal of the Central Plains. Visit our webpage on the Kansas State University's Department of History website to learn how, or you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.